The conference hall in Geneva shimmered with cold, calculated diplomacy. Flags of nations swayed gently from the ceiling, but the air was heavy, not with hope, but with tension. Cameras flashed, translators whispered. Delegates muttered rehearsed lines in hushed tones. But something was different this time. Everyone knew it. Everyone felt it. At the far end of the room, Donald Trump had just finished speaking, his voice booming through the chamber with his usual bravado. The world is safer when America leads, and Africa, like always, needs our leadership. There was a pause. Some clapped politely, others remained still, but one man did not move at all. He stood. Slowly, deliberately, every motion deliberate, charged with quiet fury. Captain Ibrahim Traoré. His presence alone silenced the whispers. The president of Burkina Faso, young, defiant, and unpredictable, stepped forward toward the podium. He did not look at the crowd. He looked straight at Trump. "Mr. Trump," he said, voice steady but cold, "you say Africa needs you. But I say, you need Africa. And you need to stop backing men like Netanyahu, whose hands drip with innocent blood." The room froze. Cameras zoomed, pens dropped, even Trump's smirk faltered for a second. Traoré's words were not part of a diplomatic script. This wasn't politics. It was personal. It was moral. It was fire wrapped in velvet. Behind him, a massive screen displayed images from Gaza, flattened homes, crying mothers, children covered in dust and blood. The images played silently, but their echoes screamed louder than speeches. "I do not speak for applause," Traoré continued, "and I do not speak for aid. I speak because silence is complicity. If you continue to fuel this war, the history books will not call you peacemakers, they will call you butchers." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. A few murmurs of support rose. Journalists were typing furiously. A new narrative had just been born. Trump, seated now, leaned back, jaw clenched. This wasn't the usual African leader he was used to dominating. This was a storm in uniform. And for the first time that evening, the American delegation had nothing to say, not yet. The silence following Traoré's speech was a vacuum, one that demanded to be filled. Delegates leaned forward in their seats. Journalists exchanged wide-eyed glances. Somewhere in the back row, a young Palestinian representative silently wiped a tear from her cheek. Traoré hadn't just spoken, he had detonated truth like a grenade in a room built on polite denial. Trump leaned forward now, adjusting his red tie, his eyes narrowed beneath his famous golden brow. He grabbed the microphone with theatrical slowness. His voice came out thick with sarcasm. "Well, Captain," he said, emphasizing the word like it was a joke, "you've clearly got a lot of passion. That's cute. But let me remind you, we built the modern world. Without us, you'd still be living under colonial shadows." Gasps. It was subtle, but Traoré flinched, just once. He had heard worse, much worse, but this was no longer a political debate, it was a war of dignity. "I thought we were done with that rhetoric," Traoré replied, his voice calm but his stare burning. "But it seems some empires never die, they just rebrand themselves as saviors." The room felt hotter. Delegates whispered now, not out of boredom but fear of what would come next. Then Trump made a mistake. He laughed, a smug, dismissive chuckle that rippled through the room like poison. "You know what your problem is, Traoré," he said. "You confuse noise with power. You stand here in your little jacket, pretending to be a warrior. But real power? That's money, influence, nukes. And guess who has those?" Traoré took a step forward. "I don't need nukes," he said slowly. "I have truth, I have people, and I have the courage to say what the rest of you whisper behind closed doors: Netanyahu is a war criminal, and America is enabling him." A few gasps, then applause, tentative at first, but growing. Someone from the South African delegation stood. Then another, from Chile. Even the representative from Norway clapped slowly, defiantly. Trump's smile faded. His power was built on fear. But here, in this moment, fear was cracking, and in its place, solidarity was rising. Traoré turned from the podium, not waiting for permission. His speech was over. His message had been delivered. But he wasn't done. He walked directly toward Trump's table, not as an enemy, but as a mirror. He leaned down, close enough for only Trump to hear. "This blood won't stay on your hands alone. It spills on your grandchildren's names too." Trump didn't respond. Couldn't. He had just been outmaneuvered by a captain from a country he never thought would dare speak. But Traoré had spoken, and the world had heard. As Traoré exited the chamber, his phone buzzed. Marie, his chief aide and most trusted strategist, was waiting outside, flanked by a quiet entourage of Pan-African delegates. Her face was pale with tension. "They're scrambling," she whispered. "The U.S. delegation just pulled a closed-door emergency briefing. And Netanyahu's team." "Let me guess," Traoré interrupted, removing his jacket. "They're calling me a terrorist sympathizer." Marie nodded. "And worse," he exhaled. "Let them." But behind his composed exterior, Traoré knew the stakes had shifted. This wasn't just a diplomatic controversy, it was becoming a global fault line. And he was standing right on the crack. A flurry of journalists surrounded him the moment he stepped into the plaza. Cameras flashed like lightning. "Mr. President, do you stand by your accusations against Israel?" "Yes." "Are you prepared for sanctions from the United States?" "If that's the price of integrity, then yes." "Are you calling for the isolation of Israel?" "I'm calling for an end to the slaughter of children in Gaza. If you want to twist that, that's on you." His voice was iron. His words were stone. But his heart beat like a war drum. Behind him, African leaders were watching, waiting to see if the captain would stand, or fold. Back in Washington, Trump was fuming. He slammed his palm on the table as Fox News replayed Traoré's words on loop. "This guy's dangerous," he barked. "And worse, he's inspiring people." A younger advisor dared to speak. "Sir, we're seeing a shift in the African bloc. Even countries usually silent are, well, cheering him on." Trump's eyes narrowed. "Then it's time we remind them who writes the checks." The room went quiet. Trump picked up the phone. "Get the State Department. We're freezing aid to Burkina Faso." Back at Traoré's hotel, Marie was already reading the news aloud. U.S. suspends economic and military aid over destabilizing rhetoric. Traoré said nothing at first. Then, "Good, now we know where they stand." Marie frowned. "This could hurt us, hospitals, infrastructure, defense." Traoré raised a hand. "And it will hurt them too, because the days of buying silence from Africa are over." That night, the hashtags #StandWithTraoré and #AfricaSpeaksForGaza trended across platforms. From Dakar to Detroit, youth lit up timelines with praise, poems, and protest chants. A mural appeared in downtown Nairobi, Traoré with a Palestinian child on one arm and a Burkinabe farmer on the other. Below it, in bold paint, "Truth doesn't ask permission." The morning after, the world had changed. Not with bombs or ballots, but with a sentence. Traoré's voice had echoed farther than anyone expected. In mosques and churches, in student dorms and village huts, people replayed his words over and over. Stop backing Netanyahu. End the bloodshed. Inside the African Union's delegation hall, tension vibrated in the air like a plucked string. Heads of state, diplomats, and observers gathered for an emergency caucus. On one side, leaders who feared losing U.S. financial aid. On the other, a swelling tide of younger nations, led by Traoré, demanding moral clarity. President Netanyahu of Kenya leaned in. "You've thrown a match into a fuel tank, Ibrahim." "I didn't throw anything," Traoré replied calmly. "The fire was already burning. I just pointed at it." Some nodded, others looked away. Madame Zaude of Ethiopia raised her hand. "If the West cuts us off, can we truly survive on solidarity?" Traoré stood, slowly, then walked toward the table. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't pound the podium. He simply laid out a file, statistics, data, satellite images. Then he opened his mouth. "Solidarity didn't kill our economies. Dependence did." A hush fell. "For decades, we traded silence for supplies. We let Gaza burn because we feared losing dollars. But here's the truth, no amount of foreign aid can rebuild our dignity." He paused, scanning the room. This isn't about Israel alone. It's about power, and who gets to decide whose lives matter. Outside the hall, protesters gathered. Not just African students, but American, European, Middle Eastern. They waved signs that read, "No more proxy silence, Traoré speaks for us," and simply, "Enough." In New York, Trump's team scrambled to respond to the spiraling narrative. His speechwriters drafted a televised address to reassert U.S. leadership. But before the cameras rolled, Trump called it off. He turned to his advisor. "You know what the problem is?" The young man shook his head. Trump sighed. "He's not playing the game." Meanwhile, in Gaza, under flickering lights in makeshift shelters, families whispered the name, Traoré, like a distant star. A 9-year-old girl named Samira, cradling a doll stitched from torn cloth, asked her grandmother, "Is he real?" The old woman smiled, eyes wet. "Yes, Habibti. And he didn't forget us." That night, the image of Traoré's UN speech was projected onto the side of a bombed-out building in Rafah. People gathered to watch, silently. Not for answers, but for acknowledgement. And across oceans, a shift began, not in politics, but in imagination. The pressure mounted in Washington. Lobbyists knocked on every door in Congress. Israeli officials called in favors. Fox News labeled Traoré an African agitator meddling in global affairs. CNN aired split panels, some praising his courage, others questioning his motives. But amidst the noise, one unexpected voice emerged. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, known for her unapologetic stance on justice, took the floor during a press conference and addressed the elephant in the room. "I've heard enough about Traoré being radical," she said, eyes blazing. "You know what's radical? Supporting bombs over bread. Silence over suffering. He's not dividing us, he's reminding us." The room exploded with questions, but she walked away, leaving the message hanging like smoke. Meanwhile, Traoré sat in a quiet room in Accra, Ghana, his temporary base for the diplomatic storm. A worn map of Africa hung behind him, and before him, 3 screens buzzed with live feeds from Gaza, Capitol Hill, and the African Union. Marie, his aide, entered. "Mr. President, we have a request from Columbia University. They want you to speak, virtually. Students are marching with your quotes printed on banners." Traoré didn't smile. "This isn't about speeches anymore. It's about what comes next." She hesitated. "And what is next?" He tapped a folder labeled, "Economic Alternatives." Cutting dependency. Mobilizing African production. Rewriting who funds who. "But Trump." "I'm not in a shouting match with Trump," Traoré interrupted, eyes fixed. "I'm in a race against history." Back in D.C., a closed-door meeting was underway. Trump, seated at the head of the table, reviewed polling numbers. Suburban voters were split. Young Black Americans were tweeting Traoré quotes by the thousands. Evangelical leaders were starting to question blind support for the war in Gaza. "He's turning this into a referendum," one advisor muttered. Trump stood. "Then we'll make it one. Set up a meeting with him. Public. Broadcast. If he wants to play leader, let's see if he can stand the fire." The room went silent. In the streets of Nairobi, Bamako, New York, and Paris, graffiti bloomed. "We're not your colonies. End the bloodshed. Traoré for truth." Something was shifting. Not just politically, but spiritually. And for the first time in a long time, Africa wasn't just reacting to history. It was writing it. The announcement came like thunder. Donald Trump to debate Ibrahim Traoré, live from Geneva. CNN, BBC, and Al Jazeera cleared primetime slots. Twitter trended globally under hashtag Traoré vs. Trump. The world held its breath. One represented the legacy of Western dominance, the other, the defiant rise of African autonomy. In Geneva's Palace of Nations, under high ceilings and cold lights, two podiums stood facing each other like ancient pillars. Trump arrived in his signature red tie, flashing cameras his practiced grin. Traoré entered in a modest, dark blue Sahelian suit, no guards, no spectacle, just resolve. Journalists swarmed the hall. The moderators, one from Switzerland, one from Senegal, introduced the session. Trump began first. Africa is great. I've always said it. But let's not pretend, he smirked, without American aid, half the continent would be in chaos. Look at the numbers. Look at history. We've led, we've helped, and yes, we've expected something back. That's how the world works. Applause rippled from the American section of the hall. Traoré did not flinch. When it was his turn, he stepped forward slowly. His voice, measured, unshaken. Mr. Trump, you talk of numbers and history. But whose numbers? Whose history? You helped, but at a price we never set. Aid came with strings, policies, weapons, and ideologies. What we want now, is not charity. It's sovereignty. He paused, letting the silence grow heavy. Africa is not a project. We are not your proving ground for failed foreign policy. We are a continent of over 1 billion souls, dreaming, building, and bleeding, while you debate our value over contracts and headlines. The hall stirred. Several in the crowd stood up, not in protest, but in recognition. Trump leaned into the microphone, sharper now. You'd be nothing without us. No roads. No vaccines. No power. You need America. Traoré smiled faintly. No, Mr. Trump, he said, you need Africa. Your phones are powered by our cobalt. Your food, by our soil. Your corporations thrive on our labor. You needed us yesterday. And you'll need us tomorrow. But today, we need ourselves. The crowd erupted. Outside, protesters and supporters clashed, but one chant began to rise above the noise. We're not your colonies. We are the future. And inside that hall, beneath the marble and flags, a truth had been spoken aloud, one that couldn't be unsaid. The Geneva debate didn't end with applause. It ended with aftershocks. That night, while most leaders rested behind closed hotel doors, Traoré stood by a window in his modest suite overlooking Lake Geneva. No aides. No lights. Just the city breathing, and the weight of history pressing on his shoulders. Marie, his longtime advisor, entered quietly. You shook the world today, she said softly. Traoré didn't turn to face her. No. I told the world the truth. Whether they listen, depends on their courage. Back in Washington, Trump went live on Truth Social, calling Traoré's speech the most ungrateful nonsense I've ever heard, accusing him of biting the hand that feeds him. Fox News followed with panels warning of a dangerous rise of anti-Western sentiment in Africa. But on the streets of Atlanta, Chicago, and even parts of Texas, something unexpected stirred. Black American activists reposted Traoré's words. Latino farm workers whispered, he speaks for us too. Indigenous communities in Arizona made murals with his face beside Sitting Bull and Malcolm X. Meanwhile, in Africa, a wave ignited. Kenya's parliament paused mid-session to discuss Traoré's call for African sovereignty. In Nigeria, university students organized forums called What Traoré Said. In South Africa, graffiti bloomed on walls, Africa needs itself. And in Gaza, where ruins still smoked and families wept, a little boy named Yusuf held up a cardboard sign for the cameras. It read, Tell Traoré we heard him. The moment pierced through every wall of denial, every speech of silence. International organizations began issuing statements. Some praised Traoré's passion but warned against alienating key allies. Others admitted, perhaps for the first time, that Africa's leadership must include more than puppet presidents and aid recipients. Inside the African Union's headquarters in Addis Ababa, leaders met in emergency session. Not to scold Traoré, but to ask him to speak on behalf of Africa at the next UN Assembly. "We're tired," said President Balozi of Tanzania. "But Traoré? He made us feel alive." Traoré received the call as he watched dawn bleed into the Swiss sky. The voice on the other end simply said, "Captain, they want you to lead us in New York." Traoré didn't smile. He simply nodded, as if destiny had caught up with him once again. The plane to New York cut through clouds like a blade through silk. Inside, Traoré sat silently beside the window, dressed not in a suit, but in traditional Burkinabe attire. Simple, honest, defiant. His fingers traced the edges of an old leather notebook, his father's journal, filled with words from a time when freedom was a dream whispered in the dark. Marie broke the silence. "Captain, the world will be watching. And not all kindly." He looked at her with calm fire in his eyes. "Then let them watch. Let them see what a free African sounds like." At JFK Airport, the reception was awkward. American officials extended formal greetings, but their smiles strained. Some had seen the Geneva footage. Others were warned to keep things diplomatic. But no one could ignore the fact that this wasn't just a state visit. This was a storm walking into the heart of the empire. Across the country, media split. CNN asked, "Is Traoré the voice of a new Africa, or a dangerous populist?" The New York Times ran the headline, "A captain in combat boots dares to confront the West." Meanwhile, conservative outlets labeled him another radical using race to stir division. But in Harlem, Brooklyn, Detroit, streets spoke louder than screens. Murals of Traoré went viral. Young artists painted his image under captions like, "He doesn't want aid, he wants respect." Traoré didn't bow. Maybe we shouldn't either. In a private suite at the Waldorf Astoria, Trump watched the reactions with folded arms. His advisors argued, "Mr. President, maybe it's time to meet with him again." Privately. Trump's jaw clenched. "I don't negotiate with rebels." "Sir," said his chief of staff carefully, "he's no longer a rebel. He's a symbol." Trump stood, pacing. "Symbols burn. I want him neutralized, politically." But even Trump knew, the more he fought Traoré, the more powerful the man became. Because Traoré didn't need a platform, he was the platform. Back in the hotel, Traoré opened his father's notebook. One sentence caught his eye. "One day, our children will not beg to be seen. They will arrive like thunder." He looked up, determined. Tomorrow, he would stand before the UN again. But this time, not as a representative of a small African nation. This time, as a voice the world could no longer silence. The UN General Assembly hall buzzed like a hive. Security tightened. Cameras aligned. Ambassadors shifted in their seats. It wasn't just another session, it was the moment the world had waited for. Trump arrived first. He walked confidently to the podium, tie sharpened, words preloaded. "America," he said, pausing for effect, "has led the world through war, peace, and progress. We have sacrificed, rebuilt, and defended freedom wherever it needed us." He eyed Traoré from across the room. "But now, we see a troubling voice rise in Africa. A voice that confuses independence with aggression. That challenges peace by aligning with radical elements. That dares," he emphasized, "to question our intentions." He stepped away to applause from some Western allies. Others remained awkwardly silent. Then, Captain Ibrahim Traoré approached the same podium. No script. No teleprompter. Just him, and the weight of generations. "I stand here," he began, voice low and grounded, "not to accuse, but to remind." He turned, eyes scanning the assembly. For centuries, Africa fed empires. We bled for their wars, we mined their wealth, and we were told to wait, to be grateful. He paused. We waited. And we waited. But no more. He raised his hand, voice rising. When I said, "End the war in Gaza," I was not interfering, I was refusing silence. And when I say, "Stop using Africa as a pawn," I am not rejecting help, I am rejecting control. All eyes turned to Trump, who leaned back stiffly, arms folded, jaw locked. Traoré looked directly at him. "Mr. Trump, you said, America will lead Africa again. But we were never yours to lead. Not then. Not now." The hall held its breath. "And let me be clear, we don't want war. We don't want enemies. But if sovereignty is met with threats, if dignity is met with drones, then understand this, we will not kneel." At that moment, applause erupted. But not just from Africa's representatives. Latin American diplomats rose. Southeast Asians nodded. Some European delegates clapped reluctantly. But most striking was the sound from the gallery, American youth, students, and diaspora voices cheering. Standing. Chanting. Traoré. Traoré. Trump turned pale. This wasn't just a speech. It was a reckoning. After the speech, the UN building didn't return to normal. It couldn't. Reporters scrambled. Social media flooded with clips. Hashtags like hashtag Traoré speaks, hashtag Africa rises, and hashtag Stop the Bloodshed trended across platforms. Inside a private lounge, Traoré stood quietly near a window overlooking New York's skyline. His military jacket hung loose, the weight of the moment finally settling on his shoulders. Marie, his trusted advisor, entered with a tablet in hand. "Mr. President," she said softly, "look at this." She showed him footage from across the globe, massive crowds in Johannesburg chanting his name, murals being painted in Sao Paulo, university students in California holding vigils for peace in Gaza, quoting his words. But Traoré didn't smile. His eyes reflected something deeper, responsibility. "It's not about me," he said. "It never was." He turned back to the window. "This is about making sure no child ever feels like a pawn again, whether in Gaza, Bamako, or Baltimore." Just then, a knock. Donald Trump entered. Gone was the swagger. His tone, unusually measured. "You made quite the show," Trump muttered. "It wasn't a show," Traoré replied, steady. "It was a truth long overdue." Trump paused. "You shook things up. The world's talking. Then maybe they'll finally listen." The silence between them was heavy. But not hostile, just real. Trump finally extended his hand. "I still don't agree with you," he said. "But I respect what you did out there." Traoré took it. Firmly. Respect is a start. Outside, journalists swarmed as both men exited the lounge. But neither gave a statement. The next morning, headlines around the world read: Traoré redefines global power dynamics. Africa no longer asks, it leads. Trump and Traoré, a handshake that shook the system. In Ouagadougou, little kids reenacted Traoré's speech on playgrounds. In Gaza, a mural was painted on a bombed-out wall, "End the war. Begin dignity." Beneath it, Traoré's silhouette with a single word, hope. And in New York, a child named Malik, an African-American boy watching the replay of the speech, turned to his mother and said, "Mom, I want to be like him." She smiled. "Then speak truth like him." Because in a world dominated by power, it was honor, not aggression, that echoed loudest. And Traoré had proved, once and for all. The future doesn't bow. It stands.